Hello and welcome. This is Columbia Basin Research's second video in a multi-part series on using Program Basin TribPit. BasinTribPit is a program created by Columbia Basin Research at the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences with funding provided by the Bonneville Power Administration. Program Basin TribPit's main purpose is to provide cohort-based survival estimates that account for the possibility of an individual fish overwintering for 1 or more years or migration periods during the downstream migration process. In the first video in this series, we demonstrate how to find, install, and get the program running, as well as how to load in the necessary files to use BasinTribPit. Please review video 1 in the series if you need a refresher on constructing the necessary files for running BasinTribPit. Today, in the second video, we will briefly review the parameters of the BasinTribPit models. Let's take a look at the basic parameters that BasinTribPit takes into account when modeling survival estimates. We will refer to an example of a model schematic as we introduce the model parameters. This model schematic shows a stylized version of the data structure of a hypothetical data set using a single release group. The fish were all released in the upper left here and then moved downstream as they moved to the right. The 3 vertical bars indicate the detection sites. The 3 horizontal rows represent the 3 observation years, years 1, 2, and 3. The arrows indicate the spatial and temporal pathways that were observed or input from the dataset. In this case, there were several pathways observed for fish released in year 1. Some moved downstream entirely in year 1. Some migrated downstream to site 1 in year 1, then delayed migration in reach 2 until year 2, then migrated downstream in year 2. Some delayed migration upstream of site 1 until year 2, and then migrated downstream in year 2. And some delayed migration upstream of site 1 until year 3, and then migrated downstream in year 3. There were other pathways possible, representing more options of migration delay in various reaches and years, but they were not observed in our hypothetical dataset, and we will consider only the pathways represented here for now. Now for the model parameters. The parameters of a BasinTribPit model are as follows. Beta Rijk equals the joint probability of a survival and movement from the initial release to the first downstream site I, released in year J, and detected at site I in year K. The parameter is specific to the release group R. On the model schematic, we find the beta parameters here. The next parameter is a phi parameter. Phi Rijk equals the joint probability of a survival and movement from site I-1 in year J to site I in year K, given that the individual was alive at site I-1 in year J for individuals from release group R. Here is where the phi parameters show up on the model schematic of our hypothetical example. Note that there are more phi parameters possible, but the hypothetical example here included only some of the possible transitions. The next set of parameters are the p parameters. Prik equals the probability of a detection at site I in year K, given that an individual from release group R was alive at site I in year K. There is a p parameter for each detection site and year combination for all sites upstream of the final detection site. The final type of parameter is the lambda parameter. Lambda Rijk equals the joint probability of survival, movement, and detection from the penultimate site I-1 in year J to the final site I in year K, given that the individual from release group R was alive at the penultimate site in year J. You can think of each lambda parameter as the product of a phi parameter and a p parameter, where the phi parameter is the probability of survival and movement and the p parameter is the conditional probability of detection. Note that the survival and movement cannot be estimated separately from detection in the last reach. Notice that there are 3 essential types of parameters: transition probabilities that combine movement and survival, detection probabilities, and the last reach parameters. The lambda parameters are the last reach parameters. The p parameters are the detection probabilities. Both the beta parameters and the phi parameters are transition probabilities, but the beta parameters refer to the first reach after release, and the phi parameters refer to all reaches downstream. BasinTribPit constructs a model using these parameters, fits the model to your dataset, provides parameter estimates. The model schematic we have been looking at shows the structure for hypothetical data from a single release group. One of the features of BasinTribPit is that it allows you to use more than one release group, as long as all releases represent the same cohort or brood year. If your dataset includes multiple release groups, then we may have information on the same model parameter coming from the data from different release groups. The way in which BasinTribPit combines data across different release groups defines a particular model for a particular dataset, and the way in which the different release groups compare in their release sites and release years determines which models BasinTribPit attempts to fit. There are 7 different scenarios of the release structure possible. The simplest scenario uses just one release group. If your data has more than one release group, then the additional release groups can be released from the same site but in different years. Or they can be released in the same year but from different sites. Or they can be released both from multiple sites and in multiple years. There are several ways to have releases from multiple sites and multiple years depending on if the releases are replicated over either site or year. BasinTribPit will identify the correct scenario based on the structure of the dataset and fit the models available for that scenario. The user is not responsible for identifying the scenario. Note that for all these scenarios, we are assuming that all fish released represent individuals from the same cohort or brood year, even if they are released at a different site or in a different year. For deeper understanding of these release scenarios and how they relate to the models that can be fit, see the user manual. If your dataset includes multiple release groups, then the default model uses parameters that are uniquely defined for each release group. As an alternative, it may be possible to equate parameters across release groups to boost the amount of information available for estimation. BasinTribPit allows for parameters to be equated in a number of different ways. Parameters may be equated as follows. 1. Across releases that are released in the same year, or 2. Across releases that are released from the same site, or 3. Across all releases regardless of release site or year. In addition, parameters that are equated may include number 1. Only the detection parameters (PRIK), or number 2. The detection parameters (PRIK) and the survival and movement parameters (phi(RIJK) and lambda(RIJK). BasinTribPit equates only equivalent parameters across releases. Equivalent parameters refer to the same type of parameter, phi, p, or lambda, the same spatial component, river reach or detection site, and the same temporal component, time period, but refer to different release groups, either from different release sites or from different release years. Beta parameters are never equated to each other because they always represent different spatial or temporal components. However, they may be equated to phi parameters if they represent the same reach and time period, that is, for a release group that was released at a detection site of an upstream release group. Let's look at some examples of equivalent parameters. Here is the model schematic we looked at earlier, showing the model structure for hypothetical data from a single release group in year 1. Here's the model structure for a second release group. These fish were released in year 1 also, but at a different release site. The parameters defined for this second release group are a bit different than those for the first release because of different patterns in these hypothetical data. Note that the phi1211 parameter in the first figure is equivalent to the phi2211 parameter in the second figure. They represent the same transition between the same reaches and the same years, but for different release groups. Another example of equivalent parameters is lambda1322 and lambda2322. Again, they represent the same transition, but for different release groups. Now let's look at the model schematic for a third release group. This represents a group of fish that were released upstream of Site 2 in year 2. If this third group was released at Site 1, then the parameter beta3222 is equivalent to both phi1222 from the first release group and phi2222 from the second release. But if this third release group was released between Site 1 and 2 rather than at Site 1, then none of these beta parameters is equivalent to any of the phi parameters because they represent a different spatial extent. BasinTribPit will automatically identify the equivalent parameters and fit models that equate them across release groups. Depending on the structure of the dataset, the user will have the option of equating beta parameters with equivalent phi parameters. Now that we have a basic understanding of the parameters used by BasinTribPit, we are ready to analyze our observations data from the previous video. We will demonstrate how to configure the model in video 3 of this series. This has been lesson 2 on using Program Basin TribPit, in which we covered the parameters used in the models fit by BasinTribPit, the possible release scenarios, and the concept of equivalent parameters and equating parameters. Future videos in this series will demonstrate how to configure and fit the model, how to interpret the results generated by BasinTribPit, and offer further tips on getting the most out of the program. If you're using Program Basin TribPit and you have any questions or comments, you can fill out our satisfaction survey as mentioned in the YouTube notes. We would greatly appreciate any feedback you have in helping make future versions of this program to be more helpful to our users. We hope that this video helps you get the most out of Program Basin TribPit. Again, if you have any questions or comments in regard to the program, please fill out our survey as previously detailed. You can also contact Columbia Basin Research at web@cbr.washington.edu. Best of luck on your survival models, and thank you.